Hello everyone, bonjour tout le monde, and welcome to Objets, Trouvés, material gatherings for new narratives. To help situate you, we are streaming on YouTube Live from Concordia University's fourth space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands here in Jagé, Montreal. As caretakers for the lands and waters we are meeting on, we'd like to extend our gratitude to the Kniak'ahaga Nation for their teachings about the earth and our relations. At Fourth Space, we work with our university community to mobilize knowledge by co-creating daily activities that invite Concordians together with external partners and audience members to examine research questions, initiatives, and importantly for today, class actions in development here at the university. So we'd like to, on behalf of all of the Fourth Space team here, signal a big welcome back to both Alice Jarry, the professor for this course, and the entire cohort of the Critical Materialities class happening this semester here at Concordia. And to give you a bit more of an explanation to what we're about to do here today, I'll pass it over to, I'm going to use one of your titles, Alice, Concordia University Research Chair in Critical Practices in Materials and Materiality, Alice Jarry. Over to you.
Thank you, Anna. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thanks to Fourth Space for hosting this event. Welcome to Objets, Trouvés, material gatherings for new narratives. This event is part of the course Critical Materiality, an advanced special topic research studio seminar that opens up new perspectives and develops joint methodologies between design and computation arts disciplines, both graduate and undergraduate. With a special emphasis on material engagement, making, and process, students develop objects, narratives, visual environments, performances, and artistic and public responses to social environmental topics linked to materiality and material engagement. Just like yesterday's session, students will present their final projects and activate a public discussion, or what we call in the class mediation. A large part of practice-based research transpires in the form and the experience of sensory perception. What happens when the studio and our materials move to public space? How can a reflexive practice be communicated and experienced? How do we foster discussion around the climate crisis in public settings? So today we speak about things, materials, tools, knickknacks, artifacts, trash, scrap, tangible things, to consume and discard, to cherish and preserve, things that capture your attention, things that define you, inanimate things, new things, and big things. So many things, too many things. Today, the event centers around storytelling, print and digital arts, and sensory attunements. It aims to open up dialogues and new imaginaries around what it means to make, think, and live with things. Jean-Philippe Côté, Raphaël Vien, Tarcisio Cataldi Tegani, Rachel Kirstein, Brianna Cormendi Ramirez, Claire Nathalie Lecker, Marianne Gripa Almeida, Shadi Rosie, Elisabeth Bureau, and Tig Riordan will ask, what do we make of all these things? What knowledge emerges from exploratory material research creation? So for now, I will let Raphael walk us through the ordre du jour for the afternoon.
Great. So after this short introduction, we'll start with the exhibition time so people can walk around and see all the different installations, as well as our remnants table, which are situated right here in front of the panel. And we invite you to write on the board with the dry erase markers speculations of what these objects are, what they could be, what their functions could be, or what they could possibly become. There's also cards you can fill out with the numbers, and we'll go over these in the panels later. So our first panel is at 2:30. It's panel A, titled Object Narratives. In this panel, there is Elisabeth, Tarcisio, Tig, Rachel, and I. And then afterwards, we'll have a short break, exhibition as well. And then we'll go on to panel B, which is Adaptation and Performance, and Permanence, sorry, which is with Brianna, Claire, Shadi, Jean-Philippe, and Marianne. And at the end, we'll have the concluding remarks. For the people who are joining us today on Zoom, we will be taking the messages while we are going through the exhibition, and then we can participate while we have the panel A and panel B.
Excuse me, Raphael, just to make sure for our folks on Zoom, the exhibition tour is half an hour?
So the panel A is at 2:30, so there's a full hour of exhibition. And then we have another break, and then we have the second panel, which is at 4:15.
Okay, thank you. So stay tuned. Okay, so welcome back everyone on Zoom. For those in person here at Fort Space, we'd like to invite everyone touring the exhibition at the moment to join us for the panel discussion. You're very welcome to take a seat and join the discussion. We have two panels today. Okay. So our first presenters from panel A, okay, are Elisabeth Bureau, Tarcisio Cataldi Tegani, Tig Riordan, Rachel Kirstein, and Raphael Vien. Welcome. Okay. But before we start, I'd like perhaps to ask questions to the public. That means the audience who were here earlier and who were touring the exhibition. Our group today prepared two process tables with different objects, and the audience was asked to speculate around the origin, the nature, the use, the purpose, the different forms of attachment produced by the objects on the table. So I'm just curious, and maybe we can use one microphone here. Okay. Anyone wrote things on the paper and tried to guess what was what? I'll open this microphone. Anyone? Anyone engage with the table here? Or André? There you go. That's fine. It's an informal event.
Formal, and then there's
Hello? Yeah. I actually got to it towards the end of my tour. So I've kind of had already observed quickly most of the projects, but I think it's very interesting to see how outside of their context, it kind of tells another story. And I think that's kind of like the intake I got. It was just how, outside of those very kind of created spaces, those objects don't really, or say other things, right? I'm not saying they don't say anything, because they do, but they just say other things, and how, depending on the context, can objects like really make all sorts of narratives and discourses.
Interesting, thank you. Were you able to guess what was associated to what, or?
Yes, most of them, for me.
You want to give it a try? It's in the final grade of the semester,
No biggie, Well, I mean, that cut plastic, I know that it's the project right there. Then there's like wood and metal, and I'm assuming it's the chair that's right there, huh? There's SCOBY, so I know that it's in the corner right there. Paper, probably there. So, did I get it right? No. Did I pass the class?
Yes. All right, thank you so much. All right, so I will start with the first round of questions for each participant, and we'll let them introduce their work and process. After that, we'll move on to more open questions, and the public will be able to ask questions and engage in an open discussion with our guests. So my first question is for you, Tarcisio. According to you, okay, you produced a fantastic video piece, including object narratives, which is the theme of today. What makes an object cultural, and how do you interpret this in your own work?
Oi. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming, you all. So in my perspective, in my work, mostly the cultural objects were daily objects, things that we are used to see in our houses, in our families' houses. So It's a thing that we are used to, but sometimes we don't like have this sort of connection. And my work was to bring out this this shift of context, of environment, of feelings around the cultural object, and to understand what is like to feeling that you belong to a culture through an object. And then I performed some interviews with people about the object, and then I used another methodology, which is the photo voice. That I didn't have to document everything, like anything, because the people owns the object, people have the connections, and I don't. And then it's better for the documentation that they document as they see it. So in a way that is presented in a way that they would like to show people. So yeah, that's, and then I for the video I inverted the narrative. I did like the object speaking about the person, and yeah, this was my narrative, this was my methodology, and yeah, that's it.
Tarcisio, can I ask a follow-up question of just for our public here and our folks on Zoom who might not have seen the video itself, of what your objects are from very specific cultural traditions. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Okay, so my objects are divided into like some sort of cultural rituals. The first one is a religious ritual, and the other one is like a cooking ritual. The first object that I presented was like a religious image from a Catholic perspective, and then I was like the owner of this object told me that when he received he was gift this object, and then he stored when he was in Brazil because it didn't have like so much meaning for him, and then when he came here he felt like he needed some sort of comfort, some sort of stronger relationship with the spiritual ritual. So yeah, he changed a lot his connection with the object. He bought like some sort of dome to keep it stored, like it became some sort of another thing, another object with this cultural shifting, I think.
Thank you, Tarcisio. My next question will be for you, Rachel. So you are working with artifacts and narratives, and a lot of artifacts. Okay? So what do you consider adds value to an object, and how can this be translated in your work?
Yes, thank you for the question. I feel like my answer to that circles around it, in the sense that I don't think that things necessarily add value to an object, because I don't know, I feel like that could get us into this territory of like beauty is in the eye of the beholder, where moving away from saying like, here are the criteria that make an object valuable or not, and therefore it's objective. Often the response to that is saying, oh, well, value is contextual or value is subjective. And I feel like it's a bit more complicated than that, in the sense where the way that value is construed with an object is it unfolds in kind of a more relational way between things, and it's activated in certain contexts, and it's things that you can kind of feel, and it's not contextual in the sense where like the context encircles the object and applies onto it, or subjective in the sense where the knowing subject projects or applies their values onto the object, and therefore it's deemed valuable. But it's something that kind of happens between them, if that makes sense, where the object also impresses upon the subject, and we're also kind of objects in our own ways, I like to think. But so that's kind of my answer to the question. But in terms of my work, I come from a more like humanities research background. I'm in the media studies program at Concordia doing my master's. And a lot of my research looks at value circulation and material things in consumer culture. So for this project, I've turned to secondhand sites, and I've done a kind of experimental ethnography of two particular secondhand sites for those of you that didn't like see or go through them. The first one was at a yard sale, and then later that day I went to the Little Shop, which is in Park X. This is what it looks like. It's a little book. And I interviewed the owner at the Little Shop, and I did this kind of ethnography at the yard sale. And I collected some objects from the yard sale as well. And there was just so many ways that you could see that like value was being activated. And so what I'm really interested in is, I hope I'm making sense. What I'm really interested in with these projects is seeing how meaning and resonance and feeling and value circulate, as opposed to saying this is this and that is that. And so the way that it shows up in my project is by like recreating these kinds of affective encounters as opposed to conveying information through photos or conveying information through text. And so I made a kind of scrapbook for the Little Shop where you can kind of see for yourself and see how things are interwoven. And then I made, I actually worked with a photo album that I picked up from the yard sale. It's kind of hard to hold the mic, and I have my photos and it's like, ooh, interwoven. There, it's fun. I feel like I didn't really answer the question, but I explained my project. That's what's happening. I'll say one more thing. That I feel like gets at the question. Something that I kept in my mind while I was working on this project, and that kind of inspired me, was this encounter that I had with somebody who I ran into at an antique market. And she said that I made the market look so much more interesting than it actually was on my Instagram stories. And I was like, I feel like you're actually just not really paying attention to what's going on and attuning yourself to all of the little details and all of the little tidbits. And I think that there's something in noticing those small moments of care and noticing those little details and attuning to the offshoots and the tangents and the things that might not necessarily fit within what your frame of value might be, and taking something that might be in a garbage pile, and then you look it up afterwards and you're like, oh, whoa, that's worth $2,000. Crazy. That happened at the art sale a bunch of times. But that's not just what it is, it's what it means to you as well, and how that thing impresses upon you. We did it.
Thanks, Rachel. We'll have time to come back to this fantastic album and all its new narratives. Okay.
Ooh.
And my third question would actually be for Raphael. And it follows up on this idea of significance, meaning, and context. So Raphael, what is your perception of the meaning of objects in and out of context? How do their signification changes for you? And how do you see that happening in your project?
So I think I'll start by introducing my project to answer the question, because I think it relates well to it. And so the overall idea behind the project is to sort of remove the dining room from the household, and also sort of modifying its content. So the objects, the artifacts, the furniture that we interact with. And so I started with the most basic item, which is the chair, which we not only find it in the dining room, but sort of everywhere in the house. It's, it can be anywhere. It could be in a classroom. It could be outside. Anywhere. The chair is everywhere. But then how did this chair function to replace the table? Because in the dining setting, there's always the table that goes with this chair. So I sort of proposed this chair that is both at the same time. So it's a regular chair, and then it can transition into a table surface, which is just by switching the way you're eating at it. We can see it. I made two, so we can sort of see both situations. And then while researching this and speaking with Alice, we talked about context. So what makes this a dining situation if it's not in a dining room, if it's in the living room, if it's possibly outside? So taking this typical dining situation into, let's say, the park, does it make the park the dining room? Which is sort of the out of context question. And then I'm not answering this. It's up to you to answer if it's a dining room or not. But basically, the furniture itself, is it still a chair and a table? Is it the combination of both? If we bring it outside, is it a dining chair? This sort of idea of context really makes it blurry between what it is and what it isn't, and what we perceive it to be. And so I really wanted this piece of furniture to sort of be blurry, because it looks like a chair at the first look, then it's a table, and then you can take it apart and put it in a bag. So I also made a bag that carries it, because it's a lightweight chair. And then like, how does it interact now that you can transport it? Is it like this, the bigger idea behind it is to sort of like domesticate it. So it's not a chair, it's not a table, it's literally what you choose it to be. Yes.
Thank you, Raphael. And my last question, in fact, I think there are interesting resonances between Elisabeth's work and Teague's work in terms of space. It's not the same kind of space. One is an auditory space, the other one is visual. They're both constructed spaces. So I don't know who wants to answer first, you choose, okay? But consider the influence of the present environment on materials and our perception of these. How are you using space in your work?
Sure. So I think in my installation, it's basically, to give you context, it's a audio installation that kind of looks to give you information on things that aren't physically there. And this comes to look at not necessarily the physical spaces, but also internal spaces or memories of spaces and events and things. So the core of my project was to look at sensorial knowledge and body memory, and how our bodies collect imprints of things and experiences in space throughout our life, and how we unconsciously make these connections in different contexts. So taking away the visual dominance of things in space that we're accustomed to in life, we rely a lot on our sight to experience things. My project was kind of looking at taking this part away and focusing on our recollection of how we have interacted with things in space in the past, if that makes sense. Yeah, so for me, it was kind of a way to access these memories of space and things. That's how I exploited the idea of space in my project.
Yeah, so a little bit in like a different vein, my project kind of, so it's a collection of photo scans of objects and sort of walls and parts of spaces from these transitory spaces, so spaces that exist to be traveled through and that you're never really meant to stay in for any period of time. And it's taking these scans, some of which are mine, some of which are Creative Commons that just other people have taken from random parts of the world, and they just exist online. Taking all of those fully removed from their context and anything that pertains to them, and putting them in these newly constructed, like newly imagined spaces that don't actually exist. So creating new context for the objects and with the objects, to make these kind of, I wouldn't call them liminal, but like mundane, uncomfortable kind of spaces that are meant to be familiar and meant to seem like places that you maybe have passed through, but there's something a little bit off with them, and then playing with the imperfection of photo scans, because anybody who's done any kind of photo scanning or photogrammetry knows that the result you get is often like pretty messy and kind of like warbly, and is full of errors. So then maybe like using those errors to the maybe not the advantage of this space, but playing with them and using that medium to influence the space itself, which doesn't really exist. Like all of the spaces in my project exist in kind of like the void of the rest of the 3D file that has nothing in it. So they exist by themselves in this like weird little vacuum. I don't know if that answered the question at all, but.
Well, it's the beginning of an answer, because I think that my next questions will be about how you got your hands dirty throughout the semester. How did you start your project? How did you make it? This is something that's often hidden, that sometimes we don't want to show or don't want to discuss. but let's discuss the cooking recipe here. So I'm just curious about, I don't know who wants to jump in first, but how did you do things? Like, what were the different steps involved in your process?
So when we started this semester, I sort of already had this idea of working around this chair that becomes a table. And so my first thought was obviously sourcing. In the context of this class is materiality, so it has a great significance. And so I was researching how to dismantle existing furniture that I could find in flea markets or on the street or whatever, and sort of repurpose them into these new furnitures. Then that proved to be a challenge by itself, because chair making has its challenges for it to be functional. And so I kept on searching, and at some point I went into my past research around this concept, which is about rituals, and mostly religious rituals. And I stumbled upon this wood recycled from an Anglican church in the Eastern Townships. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. It sort of touches on all the topics, and I can recycle this wood and repurpose it into the chair. And then I met with Christopher at the wood shop, and we talked about feasibility. And it was sort of an issue because the wood, since it already had a previous life, was limited size-wise. It was very short pieces, very small pieces. And so I really had to think about how to approach it. But I knew I wanted to also work with aluminum. So I decided to combine both materials. So the structure being aluminum, and then the seat and the back being wood. But that also proved to be its own challenge, because the chair is modular. And also, as I mentioned, the backrest becomes the table. So I had to have these multiple functions for each piece. And then it had to be light, because I wanted to be able to transport it. And so it was a lot of prototyping, a lot of work. It manifests itself into different scale prototypes. This was like the first version, which is out of paper, which sort of explains how it functions. And then I made a full-scale model out of foam board, and then I went into aluminum, which was plasma cut, and then wood, and so on. And I came up with not final, but almost prototype.
And do you have documentation of it in the bag, just out of curiosity?
I have all the documentation. It's not in the bag.
Okay.
It's on the table, but yeah, there's also the I don't have documentation of the bag, because I just made it. It just happened because I thought, I have to transport it, might as well make a custom bag. And so everything fits into like a separate pocket, including flatware. Yeah.
And can you say a few words about the potato on the table?
Yeah, so I brought a sprouted potato because obviously there's a mise en scène going on around the chair, but the idea was, so the research started with resource scarcity and how we treat and respect materials. I come from an agricultural background, and this is really important to me, and I've been growing this at home because I know that I would be using it at some point. What I want to think about this is that it's a situation of context. So it's, yes, a potato and we can eat it, it's an ingredient, but then once it starts sprouting, it also becomes sort of like a plant or a flower. So it's sort of like, again, it's up to us to decide what it is by itself, actually, which I think is sort of the same with the chair, because it's a functional piece, it serves to sit, but it's also like a discussion starter, such as this sprouted potato is. It worked. Apparently.
It worked.
Go ahead.
A little side note about the potato, I have this like beautiful like fruit bowl, and sometimes I'll store like potatoes in there and I have it on my table, and then I leave them there and they sprout, and I'm like, it's beautiful. It's like, we're working, we're good. Yeah.
Well, you can just keep going and tell us how you did your project.
How did I do my project? I don't remember how it started. I remember where it was coming from. I think it was kind of coming from three places. The first was this work that I had done before on like secondhand objects and the kinds of like personal narratives and also like collective and cultural narratives around those secondhand objects. So a chair and a plant. And thinking, so that was one place where this other work that I had done with secondhand objects and material objects that were used. The second place that it was coming from was kind of being frustrated with a lot of academic work and academic research that's really like content-based, and it's very much about like, you do your research, you have, and then you have this like text-based output that's like a journal article or a conference presentation or whatever. And I'm more interested in like, okay, well, what's the materiality, the thingness of the form that the final output takes, and how can that like activate a certain kind of experience and a certain kind of resonance in how you engage with the actual topic itself instead of trying to like extract meaning from it. So that was kind of like, I had this interest in like exploring with different mediums and formats and wanting to have it in this very intimate print form, and kind of challenging myself to experiment with like, what am I going to do with all of this like material and this data and the stuff that I collect. So those are really, there was a third one, but I don't really, I think the two there make the most sense together. And so basically I went to these two sites and I photographed with my DSLR. I took all these photos, and I also took like more, informal photos with my phone. I took field notes, I interviewed people, and I even like bought some objects because I love going to these kinds of sales and I couldn't help myself, especially because the art sale was like a treasure trove of like, they were trying to like give me away things that were worth like a lot of money and were really beautiful, that were just in trash bags. And then afterwards, I had all this material and I was like, what do I do with all of this? And then it was literally like 3 weeks to a month of me being like, trying to put it together in different formats and seeing, okay, does this work? Does that work? And I decided to work with the scrapbook format and the photo album format to help constrain me. And I consulted with a friend who said to me like, Rachel, you don't need to write a whole essay explaining this and have this extra layer of analysis or explanation. Like, the way that you conceive of these things and the way that you put these things together and the way that you see the world is enough to help other people be attuned to that as well. So that was quite nice in thinking about like, okay, what are other ways that we can tell stories and do theory and do research that are more like activating and engaging.
Thank you, Rachel. Teague, do you want to pursue?
God, what was the question again? Sorry.
How was your project done? How did you do it?
I guess like maybe not the most important, but like the biggest first step of mine was just collecting enough assets to be able to create like other environments or other worlds with. And the majority of that was me going around on my bike. I used an app called Polycam for all of my photo scanning, so I didn't need to like lug around a camera or anything. It was going around biking in different areas of Montreal and like searching for things or like structures or like little bits of buildings or like a trash can or a bench or something, and trying to like imagine them in a different context or separated from what was surrounding them, and deciding whether or not they could be placed in a different environment, which I think I looked like a crazy person, like cycling around, and I would see a trash can, I would stop, jump off my bike, and I would spend like maybe 5 minutes just walking around filming it, and then I would leave, which looks absurd. I'd do the same thing for like a bench or like anything else. That was the majority of it, and then for searching for assets that other people had scanned from other parts of the world, it was just scouring pages and pages of these photo scans that people have put up online, not for any specific reason, but just because they thought there was something cool or an interesting bit of graffiti, or like the front of a building, that they put up online. And it was difficult finding assets that were mundane enough, because these things that people put up online from photo scans, they're scanning them because they think there's some interest there, or other people might find them interesting. So nobody's going to just scan like just a concrete post or something that's just out in the street or on the sidewalk. But fortunately, people do that, and I was able to take a bunch of those, and then just kind of throwing them together like haphazardly into a scene and lighting it and kind of making it work more or less. Yeah.
Thank you. Tarcisio?
So I think I did like the most challenging thing for a designer, which is talking to people. Yeah, because this was like the first thing that I had to do, because when we were presenting our objects or materials at the beginning of this class, I brought some flip-flops that are pretty pretty popular in my country. And then my thing is storytelling, and how can we like extract some narratives of things that we don't like pay much attention, or things that just pass by. And then I started to reach out to some friends of mine, to Facebook groups of Brazilians in Montreal, like to talk to them, to know them, and then to know the objects, because I knew some people, but it was like knowing a new person, because I was trying to understand what the object means, what the object are. So yeah, it was like knowing someone. And then I collected all this information of all of these data. And then I asked people to take photos and like record videos of the object. And then some of them did it pretty quickly, some of them not. And this is really difficult to work on, because you have like to move on with things. And yeah, once I put it all together, I did some sort of qualitative data analysis sort of thing. And then I started to create this narrative of the object speaking for itself and speaking of the person that I interviewed. So it's like and then I just put it all, like all the photos and videos, and did like a voiceover in the film, and yeah, that's turned out.
To make sure I understand correctly, you did those interviews with different person from your community, but then the narratives are your own. What we see in the video is your own narratives based on the interpretation of the interviews.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
it's
great.
just a shifting of who's talking.
Yeah. And I'll come back to that after follow-up questions, but I will let Elisabeth speak first.
Okay. I think for me, when we were tasked to study materiality, my first instinct was obviously to be like, how do I study not materiality? So it went towards like absence of things and negative space and all that stuff. And starting to research how our body interacts with nothing, it really brought me towards our senses. And that's the field of study that really caught my attention, and really most of my work was research this field and what other people have done, and it was really fascinating. But I guess the reason why I chose sound or audio as a way to kind of create this experience was because through sound we can connect. Through all senses are interconnected, but I felt like through sound you can relate to other senses that are harder to stimulate in this kind of context. For example, if you hear the click sound of metal together, or like water boiling, instinctively you know the texture of water, the taste of water, you know if something's sizzling, you can feel the heat or know that it's heating up without even seeing it. So it's kind of this connection between senses that I wanted to produce, and also based on each individual is going to have a different recollection of memories and relations to objects. So yeah, I created like this, I tried to have this kind of 3D audio experience where you can fill in the space and movement around you and kind of interpret what's happening even though you can't see it. And yeah, that was mostly how it came to be, that project.
Thanks. I have an open question, and whoever wants to jump in, you're welcome. There are two transversal things and themes, and I think across your group, is the question of object narrative and the question of collective memory. So how do you think those two things coexist? Are they separate from each other, or one feeds one another? Take 2 minutes for thinking about it. Yeah, it's the question about object narratives and collective memory. Collective memory, to me, is something that builds up over a broader and larger number of individuals across time, and object narratives can be associated to one object. Do you think those two things are separate or are codependent?
Well, I think in my precise case, since I work around rituals, rituals are sort of this collective memory of traditions or things we're used to pass on. But then everyone has sort of a story with their own pieces of furniture related to this ritual. So we know the dining room because in our culture, it's used to eat, it's where family gather. But then each person has a specific memory associated to the physical table itself. Maybe it's their grandparents' table, maybe it's like the object itself has narrative, but then in a broader context, it has sort of this collective memory. And I think this is something that Rachel is sort of exploring as well, because each object is, as you mentioned, you can find them online, but then when you find them, it's different because whoever owned them first and where you found them is totally different. I don't know if you want to pick.
Hello. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I feel like it's interesting because I think both of them, it touches on the absence thing that you were talking about, where it's like, I don't know. No, I don't want to add on to it. I want to think about, I'm like thinking. Well, okay, so with the yard sale, I'm going to put the little shop aside for a second. With the yard sale, it was like kind of a really serendipitous thing. I had planned this day of like site visits for my little ethnography. And I went to the yard sale and it was just like sprawling antiques, like tons and tons of antiques, like so much stuff amassed. And the person who was putting the yard sale on, it wasn't his stuff. He clears out houses and he cleared out this older woman's house whose son put her in a home because she has dementia and he wanted the house cleared out so he could sell it. Like that's the story. And she collected all this stuff. And as there were, most of the people who were there were like the seller's friends and family helping him deal with this. And then a few of us were like buyers. And then I was the annoying person with my camera taking photos and asking people questions. And they were like, go away, we have a lot to do. But what was interesting was like, and this is kind of touching on the object narratives, collective memory connection thing, was that as I moved through this and as other people moved through it as well, just all of this stuff that someone had amassed over the course of their life, which is, it's not a critique of them, like it's almost an inevitability. Like we live with things, we have these things, it's a part of our worlds. Trying to figure out like, who is this person? Why would they give this stuff away? But then moving beyond that person. So it's like, okay, but this person had all of this stuff and this is what I think about that stuff. Moving beyond that and having it open up into like broader conversations where like I can then have a conversation with Elisabeth about this one lamp and it reminds her of her grandfather who had this thing and oh my god, my grandfather had the same one too. And then we find out that there's this kind of collective reimagining of the past existing in the present as well, and how that object then facilitates it and kind of how we patch it together in a way, I guess. Yeah, I think that's what it came to mind there.
Anyone else wants to offer a response to that?
So my project is like selecting objects that can have like maybe a narrative built around them or be built into a narrative of many objects, but things that don't have a collective memory surrounding them, like objects that maybe are interacted with often, that many people interact with, but that nobody is going to remember interacting with, like whatever trash can like at the side of the road, or a bench in some like corner of a park, which sure, there are probably a select few people who have memories with that. Maybe the bench was a bad example. I'll stick to the trash can. Like it will get interacted with by like thousands of people every day, but nobody is ever going to see an image of that trash can and be like, that I like threw something out into that garbage bin. Like, wow, remembering that memory. So putting it in this space, it's trying to like choose things that have no nothing that like stands out that will trigger any memory, but that maybe will trigger some like small sense of familiarity, but just nothing major. If that makes any sense.
It does. Elisabeth?
Yeah, this discussion makes me wonder if is it possible to create a collective object narrative that everyone would adhere to? Like, for example, if, I don't know, this mic, we're like, hey, let's build this object narrative together, and that like we all stand by it and believe in it. So I just think it's interesting to upscale things, because there's so much value in through everyone's projects here. It was like kind of a micro focus on things that the aura of one object and what its importance is, but it kind of thinking of how this could be collectively is interesting. And I don't know if it's possible, but
I feel like my answer, I mean, I'm shaking my head, is no. Like, no, we can't create a collective memory on that, and I don't think we should. I feel like the specificity is something to hold on to. I think that there's a specificity to things that together, I guess maybe that's what collectivity is, actually. If you think about it, it's not creating this one uniform mass or like universal truth or universal narrative that applies to everything, but rather this kind of clustering and accumulation of a bunch of different things that somehow come together. Like with my project, I really wanted to keep the specificity of certain things. And I think that there's a value in that. And it's interesting because I think it contrasts Teague's project, for example, which is like taking specific things, but then creating these environments that are just so like universal that it's like these could exist anywhere. I don't really know what I think about it, but there's something there that I think is really interesting. Yeah, and then also this thing of like, it's not just collective memory, but it's also like collective remembering, like the act of remembering and bringing the past into existence, and how that exists in how, like, I don't know, I think memories exist in the present just as much as they exist in the past, so.
Because I hear you speaking, and the question of affiliation and legacy comes back a lot. I'd be curious to hear you, Tarcisio, because you showed us in your project, you showed us an array of different objects. Okay, for instance, the soapstone, the cloth, other, I would say, food-related object. What if you did, say, a kind of affiliation of one single object across time and space? So what if you only focused on this cloth across different families or different communities? Do you think that there are some kind of threads that can be weaved between the different narratives of this kind of object in different contexts?
Yes, I think. I was thinking of how collective memory has many collective memories inside of it. Because speaking about my project, I was thinking that I'm from Brazil. I have this collective memory from Brazil, but Brazil is like a continental country. And then we have like the states, and then inside the states we have the cities, and all of them are different collective memories with different objects, different rituals, but we are at the same collective memory. But I think each one has its own collective memory. So maybe this is a pragmatic approach of phenomenology, but I think like it all depends on your experience or your lived experience of the object, of this connection, of this like use. Yeah, I think we are like agents of time too, maybe.
Great, thank you. I have tons of questions, but before going there, I would like to know if the public has questions or would like to offer a comment or a response to the projects that were presented today and that you saw in the exhibition. Yes, Claire? I think you need a mic. Yeah, 1 second. There you go. I think you have to turn it on. It was, apparently.
Hello? Okay. This one's for Elisabeth. I guess I'm just wondering, because you've talked a lot about sort of the presence or the materiality of things that aren't there, but you did create like a physical setup, right? So I'm wondering, maybe you can talk a little bit more about the relationship between the physical stuff that you did build and this sort of like immaterial world that you created with the audio. what are your thoughts on that?
All right. So, okay, I think the idea of building a simplistic setup came from the idea of at first I wanted to create a narrative, like a story that people could follow and gain further information on based on the audio and sensorial knowledge. But then it was interesting to talk with people who've listened to it, and like I was talking with Sarah, who's telling me that she saw the setup as more of a indication of what the subject might be, and then close her eyes and really focus on her own experience of the sound without relating it to the space. And I found it very interesting that everyone can have this different kind of engagement with what they see, and if it doesn't fit with what their body responds to, then it doesn't matter. It's all about how it makes you feel and what you see in your head. But yeah, it was really much to just give it some kind of structure. And at first I really wanted to focus on the 3D audio kind of connection to space, which was part of my experimentation. I had never done it before. I thought it was interesting to kind of play with it. So yeah, I like to see that it is relevant, but also not in a way. So going forward with this, I would have to rethink this entire thing. And I don't know. Thanks.
Any other question, feedback? Yes, Mitch.
Hope it works. Yeah, I was with Raf, with your object. It has a specific purpose that is used almost universally, let's just say. And when you had this image of bringing it into a field, then it becomes the dining field, and like that object had enough presence to enact an entire area. And then the discussion led around the idea that a lot of objects are individualized and that they have like certain history imbued into them. So how would you differentiate, like what gives a certain object, in your opinion, more power to enact an environment than other objects? Just a light question.
I think it circles back to Alice's last question about collective memory and object narratives. And so obviously, if I take the chair that I made and I show it to someone who isn't familiar with chairs or typical dining scenarios, let's say, like dining table and so on, because for us it's embedded in our culture, but it's not everybody who eats at a table with the chair. And so it's in our collective memories. So when I put this dining situation in a field, it becomes the dining field. But then it's only because I associate it with the dining room. But then what is a dining room? Is it a table and a chair, or is it a table, a chair, diningware, a credenza, and lighting? Like, is it four walls? Is it a dining that's adjacent to, like any room that's adjacent to the kitchen? I don't think there's anything that defines it. And I think that's what I'm pushing towards, is to sort of like undefine these spaces, and whatever I or whatever you or whatever anyone here determines this is the dining situation that I'm in, whether it be temporary or permanent. I think that's what I'm sort of pushing to, the disdomestication, like the verbal disdomestication of these objects.
Can I touch on the question too? That's such a good question, and it's making me think about also like what kinds of objects create a kind of room or like a kind of space with a purpose, like maybe like a desk. Or if I'm thinking of a classroom, like if I walked into an empty room and there was one kind of object in it, what would that object be so that I know what that room is? I feel like your project kind of touches on that a bit more. I don't know if you're thinking of anything.
Yeah, I think as I'm thinking of that question, I wanted to, like, it was a bit of an attempt to situate the audience in a space or a context with something that was maybe part of the collective memory, to understand like the action happens on a counter and there's a tap and that's where it's done. But then beyond this, the information kind of comes from your recollection and everything. But it's interesting to think of like what item makes an entire space take meaning, or like how much meaning can you get from one object. Yeah, no, it's a very interesting.
And also, like, what do we inherit and how can we disrupt those inheritances to kind of like imagine and create for ourselves like what actually works rather than just whatever is bestowed upon us, and engaging with that like in a thoughtful way. Yeah, or taking whatever's bestowed upon us and working with it in a way that is, again, thoughtful and works and makes sense. Yeah, it's interesting.
Any other question from the audience? Yes, Sarah. Where's? Oh, you have the mic already. Okay.
I feel like the mic is the star of the show.
Oh, hey, I got it. My question's actually for Teague. You haven't mentioned the camera work in your project, and for me at least, it's one of the things that like situates your project so well, and it feels so like it's obviously an active choice that you didn't do a very stabilized camera. And if you could talk as to like the decision that went into like doing that, because I feel like it situates your project so well, and for me at least, it really makes it.
Yeah, I'll pretend like I put a lot of thought into the camera work, but it's because the transitory spaces, you oftentimes pass through them very quickly. You're not there to like linger in them. So the camera is, I think, pushing through or panning through all of them very slowly to let you sit with that space that you would otherwise just kind of be rushing through, because it's the space between point A and point B that no reason to stay there. And you're not really given a reason to stay there in any of the animations, but you're forced to stay there. And then the choice to make them a little bit unstable is just maybe to make them feel a little bit more grounded, like feel like not necessarily that they were filmed. I guess that they were filmed. Just make them feel a little bit more real, because if it was this very steady camera kind of going through them pretty quickly, it feels very artificial, but it's also, I guess I just wanted to make them feel a little bit more real and make the viewer stay there for the 45 seconds or so that each one plays. Yeah.
Any other question? No? So don't hesitate. I have a few questions. Do we have questions in the Zoom chat or comments before I forget? No? Okay, great. So I think I have questions for each of you. Some of them can be combined, or you can create resonances between your work. Maybe I'll start with Raphael, because you're at my left. Well, let's go clockwise. Raphael, there is something interesting in your work that you haven't discussed. Is that kind of critical speculative narrative of a little bit dystopian, of agro-tech, and what do we do in the future to sustain food production. So of course you have a chair, and it's in the industrial design work, it's super interesting. But there is this whole, I would say, dystopian speculative future where food is unaffordable, inaccessible. Where do we produce it? So you kind of shift not only the narrative of the chair, but the narrative of what we eat and how we produce it. So can you discuss it a little bit?
So it all started when I was thinking about the future of agriculture in relation to the climate crisis. So I was thinking, obviously the water is rising, the soils are drying. Where will food grow in the future? But also in the back of my mind, when I was working on this, there was this housing crisis which is going on. And I was thinking, where will we grow this food now that there's like condos everywhere, yet we still need these elements to eat? And for me, I was like, first thing that's leaving is the dining room. And like, it's the room that is easiest to just get rid of, because you can eat, well, as my survey answered, you can eat in your bed, you can eat in the living room, on the couch, wherever it is. You can eat standing up in the kitchen. You don't necessarily need the dining room. It can be easily replaceable. So I was imagining the dining room becoming this sort of indoor garden space where we just grow food in the dining room, and there's sort of this self-sustenance situation going on. But then I thought, okay, so we still need to eat somewhere, and this is where the chair comes in, where it becomes a dining room. So instead of being a physical space, it's an object that becomes the room. And then yes, so this is what I was speculating on in the future, and obviously this is, I'm attacking it from an abstract point of view because I don't want to critique necessarily anything specific. It's more of the idea and the relationship we have with food and how we can rethink it to reappreciate it. And although I am proposing a new product, my end goal is to sort of undesign and go back to these basic functions and these basic values of appreciating food, but also the moment that goes around it and sort of yeah, the ritual connection that we have around it and what it can bring to society.
Thank you, thank you. My next question would be for you, Tarcisio. What I find well, one of the aspects I find really interesting in your project is that kind of reversal of agency and how you give voice to the object. Took me a while to understand. I was like, okay, that person is speaking about something. And then I was like, no, that person is the dishcloth. So that kind of, can you speak about that process of going from interviews, which were probably informal interviews, and how it was to get into someone's life and domestic life, and asking question, and then how was your translation process operating? Okay. And how did you end up giving the voice to the object and like completely shifting the agency of the project?
So as I was talking to Brazilians, I was interviewing them in Portuguese, and all of the objects were Brazilian objects. None of them were bought here. So this was a thing that stayed in the back of my mind, like, how can I portray this part of this is from there, it's not from here, but it's here. And then this process of writing down the whole narrative, it was quite difficult because there was time to think about. There was the amount of photos and videos, like the documentation that I had, and then I just started writing and testing, and then when I get to the point that I'm doing the object speaking for itself, I thought that the object speaks in our language too, because my objects were all inside the house. So inside of my house, inside of the house that people that I interviewed, they all speak Portuguese. So it wouldn't make sense that the object speak like other language. So yeah, this was a step to think of all this, like to think about this whole narrative aspect.
Did you show the video to your participants, the final piece?
Yes.
Okay, and what was the feedback, out of curiosity?
Oh yeah, they loved. Yeah, they felt like it was meaningful to them.
Okay.
Some of them were like pretty moved by this object, the video. Yeah, it was great, the feedback. Yeah.
And so my next question would be for maybe Rachel, Teague, and Elisabeth. You want to answer the same question but from different perspectives, because there is something interesting and contrasted also in your work, is the question of the abstraction of space. Like Teague, I think Rachel, you mentioned it, it's the universality of those places. They are, you scan local domestic object, but after that there's no way that we can situate ourselves on I don't know, on an overpass on top of the Carré or wherever in Montreal. It's completely apersonal, adomestic, ageographical. And similarly, Elisabeth, we know that we're in the kitchen, or we have a sense that we're in a kitchen and like the texture of the sound is absolutely beautiful, but we don't know which kitchen and why. And this is fascinating and very uncanny. You have two very uncanny pieces where like, okay, where am I? It's very unsettling. So maybe you want to speak about how and why you created those effects. I'm just curious because in contrast, Rachel's work is highly situated and codependent on one person or one seller or one thrift store or one place. So maybe you want to discuss that in your piece? Maybe Elisabeth or Tig, you start.
Hello. Okay. Now it's fine. Okay, perfect. Yeah, just quickly, I guess I wanted to move away from the visual dominance of how we interact with things and force people to perceive materials through, like, pay attention to the other qualities of materials that we perceive through our other senses. And I think that's why it was so open to interpretation, because it left to the individual to rely on their own already acquired knowledge of material and materiality and space to make sense of the scenario. So I wasn't offering too much. And I think it's, yeah, a way to detach yourself from the visuals that were feeded very prominently.
The small record, and you know, between you, me, and a few people, where was this kitchen?
So I moved apartments last week, so it was my new empty apartment.
Ah, interesting.
Which also, I saw a lot of projects that used sound as a way to perceive space. Like this video outside would have sounded so differently from a space with furniture in it, from like my empty apartment. So it's also cues to tell you where you're in, and yeah, it's just sensorial exploration.
No, interesting.
Yeah.
And Tig, why? It's interesting because you worked with hyper-local objects, and you discussed it, how the question of slowness and reassemblage of those banal, mundane objects created this kind of, I would say, new emphasis on something that you wouldn't notice. But can you speak about why choosing to recompose completely abstracted space?
I guess they're not completely abstract, like they are based on like some, or very loosely based on some actual like real locations. Like the like sort of highway overpass scene. There's an overpass over the 20 in like, I think it's Saint Anne de Bellevue, that's I'd taken a photo of because it was there was an interesting bit of graffiti that I used in other parts of the project, but in the background of that there was this kind of just the highway like stretching out. So I used that more or less for inspiration. The kind of like pier scenes there's a lot of places that are inspired by St. Anne's, but they're, again, like, because it's using bits and pieces that are local, but also bits and pieces from random parts of the world that other people have scanned. Like there's so many places that they have the same feeling, and they're similar enough to each other that so many people experience these like relatively similar spaces.
We all have a sense of those places.
Yeah.
And it's also, so it's a kind of a sense of belonging to those places, but we could be in Montreal, we could be in LA, we could be in Oslo, we don't know. Mm-hmm. So that's what makes it really uncanny.
Yeah, I maybe wanted it to, as many people as possible have that kind of nagging sense of familiarity without ever really seeing that space, or without it actually existing. Yeah.
And quite the opposite, Rachel. That's why I want you to respond to that hyper-situated practice toward that kind of hyper abstracted one, which I think it's interesting to contrast. Yeah.
It's funny because as I was thinking about it, I was like, yes, hyper situated, but also abstracted in a lot of ways, because it's like the way that I set up my display, like the main work are these two books, and they are like, I'm thinking about how to work with these formats to kind of like, not represent, I don't know the right word, but like to be specific to these sites. So there's the specificity, and I can touch on that in a minute, but it's funny because like the objects that I have around it, some of the things are from the yard sale, but a lot of the stuff is from flea markets all around the world, and from other secondhand sites and from my apartment. And when two of my friends saw it earlier, they were like, literally, I feel like I'm in your space right now. Like, I feel like you're in your apartment. So it's specific to me, I guess, in a way, but it's kind of it abstracts these things by decontextualizing it from, I don't know, decontextualizing it from time. And then in a way, they end up becoming abstract in the sense of like, here's a bunch of old looking stuff that were from, some of them are from Berlin, some of them are from Toronto, some of them are from Florida, like, but they end up becoming abstracted through time, kind of in the same way that like, when you see a photograph that's from the 60s, they all look the same somehow because they're all done with the same kind of film and they all just look old, but they're not like the way that the photo is. So then there is an abstraction there in a way with space, like, and how those things can be and recontextualized through time. But then also there's the idea of like working with the space of these books and like the space of the pages, holding it up there. Like, oh, you're filming me now. Hello, hi. When I went to these places, the little shop, this yard sale, I think of other flea markets, other secondhand sites, it's just filled with stuff and the stuff has no room to breathe. And the stuff, versus like when you go to like a very curated kind of like secondhand store or like a very curated shop or something, there's so much space. And so I really, with this, I thought about, okay, I want to have like a scrapbook kind of thing, but I didn't want to muddy it. We were talking about this earlier when I was setting up my little area, like balancing kind of like the clutter and the vibe of it, but then also giving some of these objects, some of these photos, some of these words room to breathe so that they can still be very meaningful. Because I think that when you have piles and piles and piles of stuff and all of this stuff, it makes it difficult to kind of not isolate, but really have certain kinds of messages coming through. And so thinking about the space of the page and the space of the text and the space of where these things are situated so that they're able to kind of exist and shine on their own as well.
Thank you, super interesting. We are past our time limit, so we will have to conclude. But before we take a break, I would like to take a moment to thank you all for your fantastic project, and thanks for the rich discussion. Thanks to the public. Yeah. According to schedule, we are taking a 15-minute break, and then there will be a short exhibition tour, and we will regroup here at 4:15 for panel B, Adaptations and Permanence.
Thank you.
All right, so welcome back. I hope you had a smooth break. Thanks for our folks on Zoom. Thanks to everyone in person. I'd like to quickly introduce panel B, who will deal with questions of adaptation and permanence. So from the left, my left, to the right, we have Claire Nathalie Lecker. We have Brianna Cormendi Ramirez. We have Marianne Gripa Almeida, and we have Shadi Rosie. On Zoom, currently at home, we have Jean-Philippe Côté. Jean-Philippe, thanks for being with us. Do you see us? We see you very well. Yeah, excellent. So again, thanks a million to Fort Space for allowing these kind of setup. It's extremely versatile. Yeah. So before we start the discussion, I would like to invite Jean-Philippe to share visual material of his project. So Jean-Philippe was not able to join us today, so his work is not in the space, but it will be virtually with us in a few seconds. So people in the audience, maybe you want to turn your chair just a little bit to be able to enjoy and appreciate Jean-Philippe's work.
Are we good?
Give us 10 seconds.
All right.
Yeah, I think we're good.
All right, let's roll.
Thank you so much, Jean-Philippe. This is really, really appreciated, and I'm really looking forward to discussing it with the rest of the group. So I will proceed in a similar way than for panel A. That means asking precise questions to certain participants and then going in a much more fluid manner under the form of a conversation. So my first question is for Shadi and Marianne. Okay. Both of you are using paper, but you're using paper in a very different way, and the ideas come from two different contexts. Could you please provide detail and explain to us how you're doing so? You don't need to touch anything.
Oh my God, I'm sorry. Hi. Hi, I'm Shadi, and my project is Back to the Pulp. And in this project, actually, it's a interconnected issue of deforestation on the one hand and recycling system on the other hand. And the project actually is like a bridge for these two main problems in around the world. And it's actually exploration of cellulose-based recycled pulp to produce a material that could be actually replaced by for wood to produce actually furnitures and other production that we actually produce them recently by wood. And yes, that's it.
Thank you, Shadi.
Well, hi everyone. My name is Marian, and my project is called A Mixed Waste Paper from Disposability to Sustainability. And I sort of came to the project from a different perspective, specifically sorting. So a lot of the readings I had done up to this point had sort of talked about categorizing and sorting as like the history of waste. It is how we determine if something is toxic, not toxic, useful or not. And it is sort of like the fundamental link that we have to our values. And yet, despite this importance, the Quebec's recycling centers are often criticized for being mismanaged. For example, 20 to 26% of the paper that we recycle is sent into landfills because they are cross-contaminated. And as a result, landfills become like this sort of place of forgetting, where we like don't think about these consequences anymore. So my project is basically by sort of exposing us to the papers that we find on the streets, or the papers that we find on the streets, and we're able to sort of look and reassess our relationship with that, and think about like different ways of being sustainable, especially because we have a huge problem with recycling. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne, and thank you, Shadi. Okay. My next question is for you, Claire. Okay. So just like Shadi and Marianne, you two use toxic, disposable, unloved material, okay? Plastic. But it has a very different, I would say, meaning, perception in the eyes of society and people in general. So could you tell us more about it and how you interacted with it during your project?
Yeah, so I was, for my project, I'm specifically working with HDP, which is also known as type 2 plastic. And it's used mostly for single-use purposes like laundry detergent bottles or different household cleaning products, food products. But I started thinking about this, and what's funny about HDP is that it has sort of these miraculous physical properties. It's extremely durable, heat resistant, and sort of endlessly recyclable. So I found there was this disconnect between our tendency to see HDP as like future garbage and its like actual material value. So I wanted to explore my relationship with this material by thinking about, or asking my friends and family about objects that they plan on keeping together and about keeping forever, and about the materiality of those objects, and to sort of reinterpret those objects using this unloved material and sort of see what that produced in me and in people viewing my work.
Thank you, Claire. Jean-Philippe, question for you. We saw in your video two types of material. One was, of course, like a human face or post-human face. You tell us what it is, okay? But also another set of unconventional materials with which you worked for the whole semester, and that led to this interactive installation. So can you tell us a little bit more how you stumbled onto them, what it sparked in terms of process, and what did you achieve with them?
Yeah, sure. Well, before I answered, basically what I used mainly were mannequin heads and test tubes, which both came from discardment, governmental discard, actually. And this whole materiality question is something that I've been very interested in researching in my doctoral studies. And so I think I'm going to answer your question in a bit of a roundabout way, but I think it's interesting to do it this way. Basically, by classifying those materials as unconventional or perhaps unusual, we're framing what is expected in an art context, and so which materials should be allowed in this context or in art practices. And historically, visual arts were commissioned by well-to-do individuals, so noble materials were usually mandated. You can think of the blue pigments. They were expensive, hard to make. They came to be associated with nobility. So this question is actually politically charged. And it was kind of turned on its head by pop art, which basically introduced everyday manufactured objects as valid source material for art. But before that, there was Duchamp's fountain, or perhaps Baroness Elsa's, but that's another topic, and the idea of the ready-made. And before that, there are other examples. In design, for instance, you had lacquer controfata, which was improving furniture by decorating it with lacquered paint and collages and so on. And in architecture, you had spolia, which basically meant using pieces of old building to build new ones. So technological arts, which I'm a practitioner of, draws on this long genealogy of art practices that question which material should be considered appropriate for art. So I mentioned pop art, but we could also throw in a performance art and happenings and conceptual art and kinetic art and up art and so on. So not having myself studied painting or sculpting or drawing or anything like that, I have degrees in communications, actually. I became interested in technological artifacts as source material, and so I became quite familiar with surplus auctions and technological junkyards and these kinds of places. And I've used in previous artworks plotters and discarded cell phones and old ATM machines and so on. And this time I decided to turn to other types of technological artifacts, perhaps less media-oriented ones, which was kind of a new thing for me. And so these test tubes and mannequin heads were actually bought quite a long while ago. And the glassware and the mannequin heads were actually bought several years apart. And that was kind of the point of this research was investigating the co-presence of objects and how they would each influence each other and myself into creating something new. And basically, when these objects sort of call on you or titillate your artistic fiber, there is something to be said about this. And in the scientific literature, there's not much being said about this practice of material-driven creation, at least not from a practitioner's perspective. So while this project was had an end goal of producing an actual interactive artifact, my hidden agenda was to actually investigate my own process and what it meant to create by investigating where the matter actually takes you. So yeah, I guess that's it.
Thank you, Jean-Philippe. I have a lot of many follow-up questions, but first I would like to ask a question to Brianna, and we can come back to this idea of Objets Trouvés. So Brianna, unlike other members of the group, you are using living materials to develop your objects, your books, your surfaces, also your images. Okay. So you've used a new material, I think, in your practice. Can you tell us a little bit about how your objects are made and how it relates to your theme also, which is all about mother? So can we hear a little bit more about that?
Sure. So my project revolves around working with a material called SCOBY leather. And SCOBY is an acronym that stands for Symbiotic Culture of Bacteria and Yeast. And it's essentially this living bacterial cellulose that works as the starter for the kombucha fermentation process. And throughout the fermentation process, on the surface of the liquid kombucha, there will grow a pellicule, and that is, it's alive, it's bacteria and yeast. And usually within the kombucha industry, it's either thrown out if it's not able to be reused. And I was introduced to this through a course, and I found it to be a very interesting material with a wide array of making possibilities. And so I've been working with that, and essentially when it's dried out, all the water is evaporated, and it has a texture very much like fruit leather, and it's essentially a mushroom leather. And I chose to work with that material and pair it with long-standing practices of leather work, because I found that it could be a good alternative. And I found that to be really interesting in the way that the change in material reactivates the practice and gives the practice new meaning. And I was interested in engaging with that in order to see what kind of changes it would, or what kind of experiences or thoughts it would provoke in myself. And I found it to be a meditative process. I thought it was very, because it's the craft is something that takes a while. So it's a space where I was able to contemplate the pairing of old practices with forward-thinking materials. And it was very thought-provoking.
Thank you, Brianna. I'd like to ask other participants to dig a little bit more in their process and how things are made. And I'd like to ask you also to explain us how you grow kombucha. But I'm just curious, Brianna, as a follow-up question, your project involves the thematic of mother. Could you just explain to us why? Because you have the mother kombucha, but it also refers metaphorically to other forms of motherhood or affiliation. Could you just explain to us?
Sorry, I didn't touch upon that on my answer.
That's fine.
Yeah, so Made with Mother is the name of my project, and it refers to a few different things. One, like you said, being the mother, which is the initial pellicule or starter for the kombucha fermentation process. But for me, the idea of mother also tied to, I guess, genealogy, like my heritage. So I have a Mexican background, well, partially Mexican, and I always grew up with leather objects and things of that sort, and I grew up appreciating the craftsmanship that goes behind these objects and the making know-how. And I found that this craft has a lot of value culturally, and the idea of it being passed down through generations and developed through generations is beautiful, and I think that that's how things develop through generations. And for me personally, I found that there was kind of like this disconnect, because leather work is obviously uses leather, and with the way that it's industrially farmed cattle, it's very harmful to the environment. And again, that, I guess that ties to the mother nature, you know. So I found that I wasn't able to engage with these practices because they had a negative connotation of it being detrimental to the environment, detrimental to the people that inhabit this planet. And so I found that bringing in this concept of mother is kind of, it's reinvigorating this practice and changing the meaning, the symbolism in the object, which will also, it will transmit through generations in moving into the future. So it's kind of this idea of learning from what's passed down to us and reintegrating a different value, I guess, a different perspective that's based in the present thinking forward.
Thank you. So before jumping into more open-ended question, again, I'm interested in something that we don't discuss much publicly, how things are made. What are the challenges? What are the materials? What are the steps involved? So perhaps Claire, you could start because you're right in front of me. And I know that you work with plastic, and it's interesting because plastic has this versatile usage. It's also, poorly connoted on one end, full of promises on the other. So I'm just curious, like, what was your relationship as a maker with plastic? How did you do it?
Yeah, so it's actually funny because plastic is, one of the great things about plastic is that it's so malleable. But something that I discovered through this project is that may be the case, but it's actually really difficult to access the equipment required to transform, recycle, and create, sheets out of recycled plastic and transform them. And this is something that really sort of mostly is accessible only at an industrial level. I first discovered this material by working with CP3, which is the Precious Plastics chapter at Concordia, and they create things with recycled plastic. And through them, I had access to a CNC machine, which is needed to cut shapes out of this very rigid plastic. And it's a really challenging process, and it creates a lot of waste, actually, you're creating microplastics in attempting to use recycled plastic. So there's a challenge there. It's not very accessible to people, and I wish it were more so, because I think that there is a lot to be gained just from a better understanding of the material and what it's capable of, and how it needs to be transformed. And another really sort of interesting thing I learned in working with this material is taking 2D, sort of taking flat sheets of material and sort of how to turn that into three-dimensional objects, like this rocking chair here. So that was a sort of learning process for me, to not have a means to, let's say, 3D print something, but instead to sort of have to actually get back to the basics, building blocks of an object and construct it in that way, and to really work with the material. I ended up having to sort of listen to the material and work within the constraints it was giving me, rather than just sort of like, printing whatever I wanted off of a 3D printer. So that was an interesting process as well.
Thank you, Claire. This idea of recycling, creating waste is extremely interesting. Well, tricky, but really interesting, and we'll come back to it. Brianna, can you explain to us, how did you do it? Yeah.
A lot of trial and error. I had to look up, well, first off, I had to learn how to brew kombucha, which is essentially just sweetened tea. You add the starter and you cover it. You leave it in a dark, semi-warm area. You let it grow. You let it do its thing because it's alive. And I found myself almost becoming endeared with the leather, the kombucha, because I would go in and I would check on it and I would send it good thoughts, like grow well. But also, I had to brew a lot of batches because I didn't know initially what I was going to make. I didn't know what the size of it was going to be. So I had to give myself some room for having enough material to try to test things out. And in that, I found that not every kombucha batch is going to survive. Well, not survive, but it would. Some of them developed mold, and I was still able to use them. But again, those were just challenges that I faced. And then afterwards, within the drying process, that usually went pretty smoothly. You lay it out on a piece of wood and all the water evaporates. And I also experimented with dyeing the leather. So I also made my own bio inks, bio dyes. So many of the pieces that I have experimented with hibiscus leaf, hibiscus flower tea dye. So I would do that, let it dry. And the next challenge that I faced was finding a way to treat the leather in order for it to not be sticky and for it to be also semi-water resistant, because with kombucha leather, when it rehydrates, it'll essentially become squishy again, and that would face some challenges if you have an object that if it gets wet, it just disintegrates away somehow. So I treated it with coconut oil and beeswax, and it was a lot of just trying things, researching things, going to the library, looking up tutorials, and allowing myself to learn as I made. And that's how I went about it.
Thank you, Brianna. A few questions again from me, but I'll wait. Yeah. Marianne, do you want to?
Yeah, so, oh God. I knew that I wanted to work with paper almost the entire time that we start, like from the introduction of the project. However, one of the biggest issues that I faced at the beginning was choosing a site, because there was a lot of site exploration that I needed to do because I wanted to look at what was out there in the streets. And because I initially started thinking about like maybe offices or maybe like even here at the university. However, there are processes here that already kind of take care of that already. For example, we have like soccer. My thought process eventually landed me on liminal spaces, and for anyone who doesn't know, liminal spaces is something that a philosopher and author Marc Auguet developed, and essentially he's talking about like the transitional spaces that we don't care about or that we do not hold an identity towards, that are very like temporary. So he uses the example of airports, but I can't go to an airport without, probably setting off some issues with TSA. And so I started looking at alleyways, at train platforms, metros, and I sort of started picking up like and seeing what was like out there that we typically try to ignore. And from there, I sort of started creating my own little eco center, my own recycling system, because by trying to make the paper, I had to sort of consider what was like what I was making. So each paper that I made was made with a different material. For example, some of the things I found were receipts, envelopes. I found a lot of shopping bags recently because of Black Friday. And so I have to sort of consider that, and that became a very almost an experience, because I had to engage with it, I had to touch it, I had to consider it, and I had to sort of give it new value that someone else had deemed useless. So that had been a very huge part of it. And then it was just sitting down and actually doing the paper. So that messed up my back quite a bit, because I was on the floor for like 28 hours. So that was fun. And final thing was just sort of considering like water usage, because when you're making paper, you need like for every bit of pulp that you make, it's like one third pulp, and then the rest is water. So I would try to strain the pulp and reuse the water whenever possible. So I would like use the least amount of resources possible. So it's overall my process.
Thank you, Marianne. And Shadi, can we have further detail about this beautiful biocomposite that you might want to show to the screen? And Marianne also, that would be interested, and also Claire and Brianna, maybe next round, you show those objects to the screen.
Okay. Yeah. The first idea of this project came to my mind when, because of my homeland, Iran, and when I came here, I realized that a recycling system actually started from people's house, and people separated plastics, papers from other wasted, like food waste. And so, but in Iran, actually, people put all these sort of waste materials in one bins, and many of actually papers wasted because they actually ruined by oil of food or other materials in the garbage. So and actually in this picture I show that where actually the recycling system started in Iran, in the street, after the problem in people's garbage bins. So that actually reminds me to do something with paper, waste paper, actually, and other products of paper, because I know many artists from my background that try to actually reuse paper and other products after recycling paper, because you know, after you recycle paper, okay, thank you. When you try to, one of the products of wood would be paper, and when you recycled it once, you cannot back to the original quality. So that's why we recycled over and over in here, in this chain of recycling. So I try to use, like other artists, first, actually my first step was try to produce a material that could be used in other areas, other fields, like artistic field, like sculpture. But when I produced the first examines, I actually realized that it could be something special, more special, because it was so firm, and it could be shaped in every shape that I wanted. So I realized that it could actually recycled again to produce some material that could be useful instead of wood. So here we can have less trees to cut, so we can actually reduce their deforestation amount. So by recycling again this chain. So my project actually was a bridge between recycling and deforestation. So, and the background was related to the problem in developing countries like Iran.
Thank you, Shadi. Jean-Philippe, I'm curious to hear you. You mentioned test tube, mannequin head. What happened in your studio during the semester?
Well, actually, the story kind of starts way before this semester, because as I mentioned, I go on these scavenger hunts, basically. This could be online at like online surplus auctions, or literally in various places where they keep these old technological artifacts. And in the case of both the glassware and the mannequin heads, that were actually bought online on a governmental surplus site. So the Canadian government liquidates its old stuff. I have no idea where the mannequin head fit in the governmental picture, but this is where it's coming from. And I bought them at two different times, and I had no intention of merging those two at all. But then I started playing with them. And like I said earlier, basically, this is what I'm trying to document through this research is what is this creative process where instead of I read up on the creative process, and oftentimes the authors will sort of transform it into this scientific method, as though there are like steps, and first you observe, and then you get an idea, and so on. And from my experience, and even from what I hear today from Claire and Brianna and so on, this is usually not what's happening, and at least not for me, and I'm guessing not for many artists. And so for me, the idea was, well, what can I do with these test tubes? And I presented them at at the first or second class in the semester, and I was like, well, I'm hoping to do something with that. I have no idea what it's going to be, and so it's kind of scary. It's kind of messy because you don't know where you're going to end up, and it's a process that shouldn't be time constrained, even though it definitely was in this case. Because the idea is just to try out stuff and basically to play with matter and see where it takes you. And I guess I picked those items out of this concept of the ethics of care, which Thibodeau talked to us about. And to me, they were just appealing. And it's kind of hard to say why I was finding them appealing, but they had some quality that for me felt right, and I envisioned using them eventually. And so I started working with the test tubes, and I sent them, I painted them, and I did the whole bioplastics thing too, which didn't quite pan out, but I learned quite a bit in the process. So basically, I was just poking at it and trying to figure out how it could be used. And the simple act of, because I had like several hundreds of them, boxes of them, and the simple act of just like sorting them and looking at them and trying to figure out which models they were, and if they were all the same or not, and just playing around with them, it just gets your mind thinking. And this is why I'm calling this process matter wandering, in the same sense that we know of mind wandering. And the idea is just to basically play with the matter and see where it takes us, and just have this liberty of going into dead ends and coming back and changing directions and so on. And so it's, like I said, it's a pretty messy process. But then there's this I think I'd say magic that happens, because you end up with results that you, well, I don't think you could have envisioned if it only been a mind process. And so, well, in this specific case, there's no way I would have thought of that like specific project or how it came out to be. And so I think there's value in this approach of just playing with the matter and see where it takes you. And as I don't know, somebody mentioned earlier, there's a whole learning experience by playing with matter, because obviously I knew very little about these components, and I learned quite a bit while playing with them. And the other thing is, as I said, I had no intention of merging these two, but somehow they were around. And this is, I think, one of the key findings of this research process for me, is that this idea of matter wandering takes a whole new level or sense with the co-presence of other objects. And so these mannequin heads just happened to be in my basement. And at one point I was like, well, what if I merge the two? How could that even work? And it didn't make much cognitive sense to try and attempt that, but for some reason it made some sort of effective sense to me, at least. And so I tried that, and suddenly these very sterile test tubes had a personality, albeit a bit ominous, but still, I mean, there was some. Actually, my daughter, who's walking who's coming to the basement once in a while, she just mentioned that she was scared by this thing I was building. I said, well, all right, I think I'm onto something if it's scaring people. So anyway, my point, I guess, is that this idea of serendipity through matter, I think it's powerful. I think it's valid. I think it's a lot more widespread than we make it to be. And I think it should be documented better. And this is basically what I was trying to achieve through this research.
Thank you, Jean-Philippe. Again, many comments and questions. I'll come back to it after. I'd like to shift the topic on this idea of permanence. Okay, something that is, or rather impermanence. We don't know. You tell me. But this question of maybe of transience of materials as well. So can anyone share their thoughts on the importance of considering the afterlife of our design products and their materials? And maybe their afterlife is not just material, but it might also be symbolic. So I'm really curious to hear you about this idea of the after the work. Anyone wants to jump in?
Yeah, I can start. Well, one thing that I was thinking about as I started this project is there's this big movement in the sort of like eco-friendly world of design where you shift away from plastic, because obviously plastic is bad for the environment. But I think that really speaks to the way that things disappear, or we think that things disappear when they physically disappear from our environment. So, you know, if you send plastic to a recycling plant or it ends up in a landfill, then in your mind it kind of like disappears, and oh, I can replace it with a new product that's not made of plastic and I've done my part. But the thing about plastic is that it never really disappears, of course. So sort of to reconsider, you know, maybe we just need to find, like, the plastic is here to stay. We cannot get rid of it until we find some sort of super bug that can like digest plastic and truly get rid of it forever, which, you know, maybe one day, but we're not there yet. Just this idea of reconsidering, you know, our relationship to plastic and maybe sort of giving it a little bit more love. And since it's already here, trying to find things to do with it that are more responsible and new ways to transform it. And I think that that sort of ties in to why I started examining what is the opposite of that? Like, what are objects that we don't put out of sight and out of mind? What are objects that we do keep forever? And can we sort of take the characteristics of those objects and give them to plastic so that we're actually cherishing this material that we've already ripped from the earth? So I think there's a lot of questions to be asked there about, like, literally object permanence, like if, something is out of your field of vision, do you forget about it? What does that mean in terms of materials and how they travel across the earth? And like, how can we sort of start slowly shifting that, even though that's like a mammoth task to accomplish? So that is sort of what my perspective was on that issue with this project.
Thank you, Claire. Someone else wants to respond?
Yeah, I do.
Oh, sorry about that. Maybe Jean-Philippe first?
No, go ahead.
Well, let's not fight. It's supposed to be fun. So who goes first, Shadi or Jean-Philippe?
Shadi, please do.
Oh. Okay, Shadi first and then Jean-Philippe.
In my project, actually, permanent issue was the role of designer and the role of actually people in creation. So for me, the most important thing was when you wanted to get rid of something that we have the problem in our environment, so we should actually have the possibility to get rid of it and have a sustainable material. So for me, the permanent thing was to be more sustainable.
Thank you, Shadi. Jean-Philippe, you want to add a few words on this question of permanence or not?
Yeah, totally. About the afterlife of things. As I mentioned, in my practice, I'm constantly working with old devices, old machines, old technology. And there is one specific example, and I believe this is something we can address regarding the afterlife of these machines. And it pertains to documentation. So I'll stumble upon an interesting device, and I'm interested in building some art piece out of it. And of course, the first thing that I do is try and find documentation about it. And for some reason, when a product reaches its end of life, at least from the manufacturer's perspective, they will tend to, and I don't know if it's knowingly or by attrition, but they would tend to withdraw the documentation from their websites, for instance. And so it makes it so much harder to maintain these objects or even like reinvent a new future for them. And why is that? I mean, why would they pull these documents off of their website? I mean, certainly not because of ecological concerns. I don't think so. Probably legal reasons or things like this. But I'm guessing that we should still be having this discussion of when these products die, or well, not even die. I mean, they're just out of fashion, because basically a lot of the machines that I use are working perfectly fine. It's just that we don't like them. We don't find them attractive or interesting or useful anymore. But they can be reinvented, and they can find new meaning in a different context. And perhaps I could cite another example, which is similar. I'm old enough to have worked with Flash to create websites in a previous life, and so I invested a lot of time in learning this, and I worked on many different projects. And for whatever reason, at one point, Adobe decided to sunset this product. Well, it was caused by a unilateral decision from Apple, but anyway, that's another topic. But the point is that when they killed this technology, basically millions of websites stopped working. And this is like a huge portion of the cultural heritage of the early web that is just gone. I mean, if you compare that to when the Taliban destroyed the Buddhas at Bamiyan, I mean, the whole world was in shock, and it made news all over the world. But then it seems like destroying this whole swath of digital culture was not as much of a problem. Anyway, I guess digital culture is quite young, and we may not feel it deserves to be preserved yet. We'll get there. but I'm guessing this is something we'll come to regret. So yeah, I'm not in the design program, so I'm not sure what is being taught in those courses, but definitely the whole life cycle of a product should include whatever possible future this product may have, and this can take many different forms.
But Jean-Philippe, just as a side note, do you know curator John Ippolito?
I couldn't hear that.
Do you know the curator John Ippolito?
Yes.
Yeah, so he has a very interesting approach where when he works with digital artists, he kind of anticipates obsolescence, and he asks the artists or the designers, if your work would be exhibited in like 20 years, what's the baseline version that you would agree upon to be shown? So that's quite of an interesting approach, because I'm also old enough to have witnessed Flash, and when I became good at Flash, it was obsolete. I was like, oh damn, I have to learn something new. So anyway, so that question of obsolescence is also, as you mentioned, I thought it was very interesting. It's technical, it's technological, but it's also cultural and symbolic. Like, what do you lose when all those artifacts disappear? So Marianne and Brianna, do you want to respond to that question of temporality and permanence, or impermanence?
Yeah. Sure. I mean, I sort of just want to hop on what Claire said about forgetting and sort of trying to take something out of its context or its place, because we no longer want to associate with. And I think that's not just plastic. I think that's just trash in general, especially because we have a very tumultuous relationship with trash. We see it as impure. We see it as the destroyer of culture and a nature all at once. So we have a sort of really negative outlook on it, especially because it's like we think of like progress and civilization is like how we like get rid of it, how clean our cities are. So sort of recontextualizing that relationship, I think, is one of the first steps of doing that, of having like permanence, and also just making things trash that we care about, things that, you know, we just won't throw away like the minute that we use it one time. Like I think that's an important aspect that we need to consider, and also just again considering how we view things around us.
Thank you, Marianne. Brianna, you work with ephemeral material, living materials that stop to live at one point, so we make use of it, but that can still be reintegrated in natural cycles. So how do you work with the question of permanence in your work?
It's a big question.
Ta-da! It's 5:15.
Right.
Almost.
I guess the way that I approached it was to think everything that's already, like the materials that we have, they're not going anywhere. You know, they already exist. And I was drawn to the idea of doing better with what we already have. And also within design, we're introduced to this idea of like the circular economy, and how can we give things several life cycles and not just let them die at the end of that particular stage of life that it has. And I was also interested in the sustaining of cultural knowledge, and how can that, because there's value in craft and in ways of making that are long-standing. And I thought within the leather practice, for example, it would be very sad to let that cultural knowledge die because the material itself doesn't align with a vibrant future for the rest of the world. So I thought that by pairing it with the mushroom leather, it's almost like giving the practice a chance to continue on and to have another life cycle, but paired with a different material. And yeah.
Thank you, Brianna. So I see the time, and I have many questions, but before asking my own questions, I just want to know if the public wants to respond to what was presented today, if you have comments, if you have questions of any order, we're there to answer them, so feel free. Anything you, oh yes, okay, we'll give you a microphone. Oh, you have one, thank you.
So this is a question mainly for Marion, but I suppose could expand to the others. Marion, in your piece, you assign names to all of the individual pieces of paper. Some of them were kind of interesting, blended up children's dreams, kind of. This is the kind of thing that sticks in your mind, but you sort of gave stories to the materials themselves. So what was kind of like the process behind it? What was your thoughts behind giving the materials that you're recycling or upcycling these kind of stories, or continuing the material?
Well, for blended up children's dreams, I just have a really sick sense of humor. But essentially, what that was that was originally a magazine with that was advertising like kids' toys, especially because Christmas is around the corner, and it reminded me of my childhood. And like flipping through those and like going up to my parents and like pointing and being like, this is what I want, this is my Christmas dream. So like I having to revisit that again as an adult was very much almost an indulgent experience where I added value, and I had an emotional connection to it. And so putting that magazine in the blender felt like I was blending dreams in a certain way. But like for all of my other papers, they were just sort of trying to give them a story, trying to give them value, trying to make a connection with them. Like for example, this paper right here is made from receipts, and this one is called Her Name Is a bunch of asterisks 0014, and it was because this woman had been the first person I saw like accidentally drop like a receipt on the street, and so I sort of started associating every receipt that I got with her. And sort of trying to, and so like I would just look at what people bought and I'd be like, oh, well, she just bought a can of tuna today. I wonder if she's making a salad. So like it just became that. It became almost like me trying to connect with it emotionally and not just see it as paper, trying to just see beyond it and trying to see the human connection to it. That's basically what it is.
Thank you, Marianne, and thank you for the question. Anyone else wants to, yes? It's your, you want me to go, Anna? Okay.
Thank you. Well, it is very interesting experience, and I think it is very good that we see if each person have enough knowledge about the background environment that they comes from, and use the environment and try to redefining object to the new materials, and it is very interesting for me. And I'm very curious and have asked a question for the Shadi and Rihanna. I borrowed one of egg boxes to you. I think it's now changed to the new materials. It's really glad to see that. But what do you see the future of this kind of the materials, and how do you see the future of these materials, and what is what the goals will be pursued for the meaningful experiences for the users and for the designers who want to use that? What do the goals of these materials?
The goals of these materials. Who wants to answer first? I think everyone could answer that question.
About the future of this material, I think it has some potential for industry. I'm not sure, but there should be some other experiment like waterproof, or adding colors to the material, and measuring how it could tolerate the force and the burden on the material. So there are many spaces to work on. So, but it's not finished. But I'm thinking about completing it. And about the goal, I think the goal of the project could divide it into many scales. First, it could be related to the environment and saving it from many aspects like deforestation, and using sustainable material that could be friendly for the environment. And also in other scales could be like for the developing countries that dealing with recycling system, and it could be useful to have some sort of movements to create social movement, or I don't know, maybe something like this to help the recycling system a little bit.
Thank you, Shadi. And I would be curious to hear Claire about the future, and because speaking of goal, there's a lot of pressure. But what are the potentials of this specific material?
I don't think that recycling is necessarily like the most, or like the be all end all of like sustainable development. I think there's like a lot of issues with recycling, and sort of the best thing we can do is to just reduce the amount of things that we make and produce. But I think the first thing would be to vastly improve like the existing recycling streams, because they're not really working right now, and also to make this kind of plastics recycling more accessible to people. Because I think that this kind of material, which is made from like things from my recycling bin, is really amazing and has a ton of creative potential. And I think that especially like as a design student, I think that there's potential there for like prototyping and essentially making things out of free material. So I just think that there needs to be more accessibility and to just reconsider the entire recycling system, but that's not my field of expertise. So.
And Brianna, do you want to briefly speak about the potential of this material? Because I was really curious when you presented earlier. I know how much time it takes to grow kombucha. And what's interesting is that it will grow as large and in terms of width and height, same thing than the container it grows in. It just takes more time, that's it. Plus after that, you have the main d'oeuvre and the time for making something with it and drying it. So I'm just thinking in terms of course, we're far from some like massive commercialization of kombucha as a material. However, in the near future, what potential do you see, at least for your practice?
I am definitely interested in furthering my research with SCOBY leather. I think that it's incredibly versatile, depending on how long you let it grow for it, and when it dehydrates, it's the thickness of the leather itself varies. So if you leave it longer, it'll be thicker and more resistant, and that could be aligned with different applications, more, let's say like garments or something that would need to be more enduring, more resistant. But a lot of people are using it nowadays for different things like phone cases or anything that could be, you could think of that would be made of leather. And I think that it's definitely worth exploring. Also, you can vary the color of it, and like you said, it's also afterwards dependent on what you decide to do with it. I think a lot can be done with it. I'm not exactly sure where it's leading just yet. I just know that I think I see the value in it, and I'm interested in furthering that. And I think it's also really, for me at least, as a design student, it's empowering to think that this material, I'll show it. I made a hand-bound SCOBY leather book, and it's very easy to, let's say, start, because it takes very few materials, very little energy, and it does take a long time. But I think that there's value in that, because it does take longer, but it leaves room for consideration. And I'm very drawn to this idea of slow making rather than mass production very, very quickly. And it allows for objects that are embedded with more intentionality, which I think is important moving forward for us to consider more broadly what goes into the making of the objects that we live with. Yeah.
Thank you.
May I add something?
Oh, yes, sorry.
Actually, I wanted to jump off of what Claire was saying, but I just loved what Brianna was saying, and I wholeheartedly agree with everything she's saying. And I think it applies to crafts, but it applies to other practices as well. And I feel it applies to what I'm doing, and this idea of slow making and taking the time and trying out stuff, and yeah, all of that. Anyway, what I wanted to say was, because Claire was mentioning how recycling was basically broken, and I agree with that. One way perhaps to fix it or to improve it would be to not necessarily put the responsibility of it on the end consumer. What I brought to for the remnants table today was this little container of tiny metal pins, and I started collecting them very, very late, much too late in the project. I should have collected them earlier. But what those are, they're actually trimmings of the end of the LED lights that I used inside the tubes. So these LEDs, they have 4 pins, and most of these pins are just cut off after being soldered. And if I'm doing this on a very how can you say that? I'm looking for the word, but I mean, if I'm doing this in a very located practice, I can only imagine what those trimmings are in industrial practices. And so the idea of the trimming has been looked at a lot, I believe, in the agricultural sector, and there are some research ongoing about what we can do with potato peels and these kinds of things. But I think we should be looking at the same thing, the idea of technological trimmings, and what we should be doing with them much earlier in the production process than just passing on the responsibility to end users to fill their blue bins.
Well, yeah, thank you, Jean-Philippe. Hey, I see time, it's 5:22, we will have to conclude, but perhaps as a closing remark for your panel, well, first of all, congratulations to everyone, to Jean-Philippe, to all the participants here. And what I found extremely fascinating and rich today is how all your work deals with the question also of adaptation in relation to materials, but also in relation to other forms of assemblages of humans and more than humans. For example, Claire, in your work, we haven't touched base a lot on this, but I know that there is this this kind of movement toward the other, listening to their stories and trying to interpret that. And it's also interesting because there is this idea of, I would say, I don't want to play on word because you're working with plastics, but this idea of plasticity of practices. And there's a fantastic book written by Catherine Malabou named Plasticity in the sense of malleability, how materials are malleable. And it's also touch-based on Georges Didier Huberman, fantastic text about wax, and how wax can be in as much liquid, solid, shred, and so on. So how materials change shape, but through that changes us. And so basically, this idea of adaptation in your practice, Jean-Philippe, with this heuristic model of going iteratively and shifting with the materials while listening to their voices, and Brianna to attending to the slow rhythms of living matter, attending to the street, something you haven't mentioned a lot today, like being the rag picker and like picking up those things is a form of adaptation to the urban environment as well. So it's a fascinating topic that we should expand further when we have time. And also, Shadi, like this idea of like, how can you adapt ways to a 3D material to create new forms for the built environment? So I think it's a kind of thread that runs both in panel B and panel A as well. And as I would say a broader conclusion, it's the end of the semester. I'd like to thank everyone, every student in the class, Critical Materiality. It was such a pleasure and such an honor to work with you during this whole semester. Every week is a learning experience for a prof, for students as well, but for profs also. So we have to take this exercise humbly. And yeah, so it was really a dynamic semester. Every one of you brought like rich ideas to the table, different perspectives. It was absolutely fantastic. And finally, a big thank you to Doug, Anna, Jacqueline, everyone at Fort Space for co-organizing this event.